This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. I woke up in the middle of the night with an oppressive feeling as if someone was calling my name. The voice was hoarse, unfamiliar, sounding like an echo that merely hinted at its existence. My heart pounded and fear constricted my chest. I sat up in bed and looked around. The room was engulfed in thick darkness. The curtains, which always let in moonlight, now seemed like a dense curtain, as if the night itself had decided to cover everything with its dark veil. I reached for the bottle of pills prescribed by my doctor, but it was empty. Yes, it had been a long time since I last visited him, and I definitely need to sort that out. But not now. Right now, the darkness troubled me. But it wasn't just the darkness, the sense of presence. It grew, enveloping me with a sticky shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was standing behind the door, capable of awakening terror without a word. The silence seemed heavy, like thick mud, stifling any sound. Then there was a noise, a dull thud on the door followed by rustling as if someone had slid down. It wasn't a cat's jump or a draft. The sound was too purposeful to be accidental. It seemed like a signal, a message waiting for my response. I stood up, feeling the cold floor burn my feet. Step by step, holding my breath, I approached the door. My hand paused over the handle before I dared to turn it. The corridor outside greeted me with oppressive emptiness. Nothing but darkness, thick and immobile, like stagnant water. But at the threshold lay an envelope. Old, tattered, as if it had been lying somewhere for years. Its surface was slightly moist, and the edges looked like pages gnawed by mice from antique books. There were no stamps, no marks, just my name in an untidy, shaky handwriting. Strange. Someone still using paper letters. I bent down and recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my grandfather's. My grandfather, who had died 3 years ago. The world seemed to collapse around me. My head buzzed, my legs buckled. It was someone's cruel joke, I had no doubt. But who would do such a thing? Why? And most importantly, why was it his handwriting? A nasty chill spread through my chest, but with it, a wave of strange warmth, as if the envelope reminded me of a past I had tried my hardest to forget. I picked up the letter with trembling hands and returned to the room. The light stung my eyes, but I needed to see what was inside. Tearing open the edge, I pulled out a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, shaky, almost insane. The ink flaked off, leaving stains that smelled of something strange. A mix of mold and burnt wood, as if it were made from some kind of dust. Megan, if you are reading this letter, I am already dead. But my mistake lives on. You must correct it. There is something that needs to be destroyed. A Japanese order that I brought home after the Battle of Okinawa, which I have kept all this time. This order brings death, discord, and grief. I hoped I could control its evil, but I was wrong. Now you must do it. The order is hidden where your mother left her last tears. Find it and burn it. If you do not, one day it will find you and change your life for the worse. The words burned me more fiercely than cold metal on a frosty night. I read the letter several times, but its meaning became more ominous each time. An order? My mother's last tears. All these metaphors, these riddles. I didn't know what to think. I threw the letter on the table, but it seemed the room got even darker, as if the light now feared to look into the corners where the cursed order might be hiding. Every rustle seemed to whisper, and the shadows seemed deeper and denser than before. I turned the light on and off, but nothing changed. It seemed the room lived its own life, absorbing my anxiety. The letter lay there, motionless, but I felt its presence growing stronger. It was calling me. By morning, I knew what I would do. I would find this order, destroy it, and end all this, even if it was just to get my life back on track. But deep down, I knew. After this night's letter, nothing would ever be normal again. My grandfather's house greeted me with grim silence. Its facade, once proud and strong, now looked decrepit and subdued, like an old man who had lost his zest for life. Each brick seemed to breathe the past, hiding secrets that would prefer to stay buried. But what was most frightening was not its dilapidation, but that the house seemed to be looking at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that its windows, like empty eyes, watched my every move. I paused on the threshold, looking at the peeling paint on the door, which now resembled human skin, cracked with age. The wind blowing from the wasteland behind the house seemed to whisper something, its voice sounding like a plaintive moan. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling in my hands, and pushed the door open. It creaked dully, as if reluctantly letting me in. The air was heavy with the smell of dampness and abandonment. The floorboards under my feet creaked loudly, as if protesting against my presence. The house was empty, but it felt like I was not alone. Somewhere in the depths of the corridors, something cracked, as if the darkness itself was breathing. I walked slowly, looking into each room. Everything seemed frozen in time. On the living room table, a mug sat with a thin layer of dried dust next to it, a newspaper yellowed and crumbling at the corners. But the strangest thing, there were no cobwebs in the house. Usually in such places, spiders weave their webs in abundance, but here there were none. No signs of life except dust and silence. I ascended the stairs to the second floor. Each step echoed as if the house was repeating my movements. Ahead at the end of the corridor was my grandfather's bedroom. Its door, slightly ajar, creaked in the draft, like a whisper from another world. Behind it was the chest he had written about in the letter. The chest stood in the corner of the room, half hidden by a long faded curtain. It was an old, sturdy oak chest with metal corners. Its surface was covered with intricate carvings that seemed more than just decorations. Each line, each swirl seemed like fragments of symbols, as if the chest was both a work of art and a sealed curse. The key hung on the wall, on an old chain. It was covered with patina but felt as cold as ice. When I took it in my hands, I felt a strange tingling, as if the metal was not just old, but alive. I turned the key in the lock. The click was loud, almost deafening. It felt as if the whole house tensed, holding its breath. When I opened the lid, time seemed to stop. The air became dense, sounds were muffled, and my heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear my thoughts. Inside, wrapped in an old military coat, lay the order. At first glance, it appeared harmless, a metallic emblem in the shape of a flower with sharp petals. Its edges shimmered as if the metal was coated with liquid light. At its center was an ancient symbol, surrounded by inscriptions in Japanese. It was an artifact that had survived the war, and it radiated something. Dark, oppressive, almost sinister. When I reached out to take it, something changed. The air in the room became heavy, like before a storm. There was no sound, as if I was deep underwater. The light filtering through the dirty windows sharply outlined the objects. The order seemed to breathe in my hands, and with each of its breaths, it became harder for me to breathe. Then the whispering started. It was soft, barely discernible, as if hundreds of voices spoke at once. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning. They were reproaches, condemnation, pain. The voices grew louder, penetrating my head, filling it to the brim. "Shut up!" I yelled, throwing the order back into the chest. The whispering stopped, but the room didn't return to its previous state. It breathed. The house breathed. Gathering all my courage, I took the order again, wrapped it in fabric, and ran out of the house. The air outside was so fresh that I almost choked when I tried to inhale. But even outside, I felt its presence. The order was with me, and its shadow was now mine. In the backyard next to the barbecue pit, I stood, looking at the fabric wrapping the cursed object. The oven was old and sooty, but still functional. I kindled a fire, my hands trembling as I added logs. The flames flared up, but they seemed strange, almost alien, too dim and not hot enough to warm me. I threw the order into the fire. The moment it hit the flames, they surged upward, bursting out of the oven, enveloping me with their heat. The metal of the order didn't melt, but it moved as if something inside it was seizing it. And then I saw faces. In the flames and the tongues of fire, black and white images of people flickered. Their eyes were empty. Their lips whispered words I couldn't understand. The fire began to make sounds, a crackling like tearing metal. The order rattled, and at that moment I felt a pain in my chest, as if someone was squeezing my heart. The last sound was a crack, and all that was left of the order was a heap of ashes, shimmering with ominous colors. I sat on the ground exhausted, not understanding what had just happened. In the morning, returning home, I felt that everything had been in vain. At the door lay a new envelope just like the first. The same handwriting, the same weight, the same ominous secret. Broken, I opened it. Inside was a new text. This was only the beginning. Every step will be harder. If you stop, it will all have been in vain. I dropped the letter, feeling the cold seep under my skin. I realized one thing. This will not end. It couldn't be letters from my grandfather. Who is sending me these letters? Why does he know so much about my grandfather? Unless my grandfather knew for sure that I would fulfill his request and therefore planned several letters. The day stretched endlessly. Returning to my grandfather's house and destroying the order left a black hole inside me, a void that grew deeper with every minute. I tried to convince myself that it was all over, but it was a lie. The new envelope found in the morning at the doorstep shattered any illusions. I stood in the kitchen clutching the letter. The paper was soft and slightly damp, as if it had been pulled from the ground. This time the text was short, almost commanding. Megan, the order is destroyed, but that was only the first step. Now you need to sever the connection with the past. In the attic of your grandfather's house is an old family photograph. Find it and destroy it. Only then will you be free from the curse. What other curse? Are you kidding me? No, it couldn't be my grandfather. This is all one big trick. But what about this photograph? The photograph. I remembered it from my childhood. A family shot taken when I was 5. My mom, dad, grandfather, me and my sister Sophie. At first glance, it was an image of a happy family, but I always felt something strange, elusive, as if the faces in the photograph changed over time. The eyes became wider, the smiles more strained, and the shadows around them thicker. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Megan," a familiar voice called out. It was Julia, a longtime friend. We hadn't seen each other for many years, but her appearance was like a lifeline. She looked worried. "I tried to call you, but you didn't answer," she said, stepping inside. "Are you okay? You look strange." I nodded, although everything inside screamed that I was not okay at all. Julia was always the one who tried to protect me, even when we were kids. She knew about some of our family secrets and never told anyone, and now it seemed she sensed that something had happened. "Let's go. I'll show you what's happening," I said, not wanting to lie to her. Perhaps by telling everything I could find a way to cope with it. Silently taking the car keys, I walked to the parking lot. Julia puzzled but following behind. We returned to my grandfather's house, and I told her about the letters. Julia listened silently, but her face reflected a mix of fear and disbelief. "Are you sure it's not just someone playing with you?" she asked when I mentioned the whispers and strange events. "I thought so too," I replied, heading to the attic. "But this is something more." She looked at me anxiously, as if I was seized by a feeling of déjà vu, as if I had seen such looks before, but at that moment I couldn't remember under what circumstances, as if something invisible was eluding me, blocked deep in memory. The attic was just as I remembered it. Low ceiling, old boxes, and the smell of dust. But now it seemed that the air had become thicker, and the shadows in the corners deeper. We found the box with the photograph in the far corner. The photo was wrapped in dense fabric. When I unwrapped it, something inside me flinched. The faces in the photograph looked wrong. The eyes were slightly blacker than I remembered. There were no smiles. We all had square, heavy jaws and large foreheads. Everyone looked unwell. "Is this it?" Julia asked, leaning closer. I nodded confusedly. "Do I really look like that? Are you going to destroy it?" There was anxiety in her voice. "Yes," I replied. "That's what the letter said." But before I could act, something happened. The shadows on the ceiling stirred, At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then one of the shadows elongated and moved toward us. It wasn't just ordinary darkness. It looked dense, almost material. I clutched the photograph to my chest, feeling it become warm, almost hot. "We need to leave," I shouted, but Julia couldn't move from her spot. The shadow stretched out, forming a figure. It was a man. His features were unclear, as if seen through dirty glass, but I recognized him. It was my grandfather. "Do you want to destroy memory?" His voice sounded muffled, like a distant bell. "Family roots cannot be uprooted." I froze, as if I had turned into a stone statue. Julia, snapping out of it, grabbed my hand, trying to pull me out of the room, but grandfather raised his hand. "It's all lies," I shouted, feeling anger battling with fear. "You wanted me to do this." Somewhere in the distance, like a backdrop, I heard Julia's frightened whisper, "Who are you talking to?" But her words were drowned out by a whirlwind of noises and flashes of light. "Not everything that seems right brings freedom," my grandfather replied, approaching. The figure lunged forward and the room filled with noise. Julia screamed, but her voice was quickly muffled by a roar. The shadow enveloped her and she fell. I saw her face contorted in terror, as if I was 2 inches from her face. "No," I screamed, but it was too late. A sudden flash of light, and I came to, kneeling in the yard. It was already evening. It seemed I had been unconscious for a couple of hours. My hands were dirty and bloody. A shovel lay next to me, caked with chunks of earth. There was no sign of Julia. It seemed she had either driven away, leaving me here, or perhaps she was taken by that ghost. Explaining her disappearance this way, I stood up. In that moment, I realized that I was caught in some paranormal situation where grandfather was not the savior. He was part of this horror, perhaps even its creator. I sat behind the wheel of the car, leaving mud and bloodstains everywhere. I was so shocked and lost that at that moment I didn't even realize that I had no injuries, except for bruised knuckles. Grandfather was not who I thought he was. Now I knew I had to dig deeper into the truth. The next morning I was awakened by a call. Its sharp, insistent sound broke into my dream, filled with images of Julia, the dark attic, and photographs that continued to live their own life. My hands trembling, I picked up the phone. The screen displayed an unknown name, Morgan's Anderson. I froze, feeling cold sweat run down my neck. This name was familiar to me. Morgan's was an old friend of my grandfather. I had seen him only once at the funeral, but his gaze, it was too attentive, too lingering. "Megan," said the voice on the other end of the line, dry and trembling as if the person was speaking through a layer of dust. "We need to meet. It's important." We met in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Morgan's looked as if his last visit to our world had taken more out of him than he could bear. His face was worn, hands trembled, and his eyes were infinitely empty. "I know what he did to you," he began, not waiting for questions. "He's done it before." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Your grandfather." His voice grew a bit louder. He was obsessed with his family, but not with love. It was a mania, a curse. Morgan's told me about his friendship with my grandfather, about how he, Morgan's, had witnessed grandfather refusing to let go of the deceased, keeping them in this world with the help of something strange. For a moment, Morgan's got up to grab a napkin from the bar. During that moment, a young guy came over and tried to flirt, throwing out some nonsense about a lonely princess in the cafe. It seemed very odd to me, since he saw that I was sitting with someone else. I dismissed him just as Morgan's was returning to our table. The guy left a piece of paper with his number on the table in case I changed my mind and went back to his table, miraculously not bumping into Morgan's. "It started with your grandmother," he said. "After her death, he locked her ashes in the house. He claimed it was to preserve her memory, but that was a lie. He did it for himself, for control." I listened, unable to grasp where he was leading. "His letters, they're pulling you along. He wants you to finish what was started." "Finish what?" I asked, feeling my fingers clench into fists. "Destroy his mistakes," Morgan said. But there's no liberation behind it. He's using you." After his words, everything inside me screamed that I should not return to my grandfather's house. I left the cafe in a panic and wanted to ask Morgan something else, but he was nowhere to be seen. For some reason, I had the napkins he brought from the bar in my hand. But when I got home, a new letter was already waiting for me. It was heavier than the previous ones, as if the paper was soaked with moisture or blood. Inside it said, "Grandmother was the last hope of our family. You must destroy her ashes. They are not just remains. They are an anchor that holds us all. Do it. Otherwise, her pain will become yours." Grandmother's ashes. I remembered the black urn that stood on the mantelpiece. It was always covered with a layer of dust, but grandfather treated it as if it were the most sacred relic. I didn't want to do it, but Morgan's was right. The letters were not requests, but chains, and each new chain tightened around me more and more. The urn was heavier than I expected. Inside, something rustled faintly, like dried leaves that rolled over from my movement. I took it out to the backyard, to where my grandfather's workshop once stood. As I kindled the fire, I noticed that the air around became dense, almost viscous. It seemed as if the sky bent closer, as if something was watching me from above. When the flame ignited, I lifted the urn over my head, ready to throw it into the fire. But at that moment, I heard a voice. "What are you doing, girl?" I turned around and there she stood, my grandmother. But it wasn't quite her. Her eyes were a bit lighter than I remembered, her hair a bit shorter. She stood motionless, like a statue, but her gaze pierced right through me. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked, her voice both pleading and angry. "Is that you?" I whispered, feeling the urn in my hands begin to tremble. "You shouldn't have trusted him. He's using you," she said. "Who?" "Grandfather. He's forcing you to destroy us so he can remain. He always wanted the family under his control, even after death." I felt the flame start to wane. The stove, which had just been burning brightly, now made a strange low moan. "You have to choose," my grandmother said, and her figure began to flicker as if it was a projection on a screen. "Burn me and become his last victim, or stop him." I froze. The choice seemed impossible, but one thought, quiet and sinister, crept into my mind. What if she is also lying? I threw the urn into the fire. The flame exploded in a bright light, and I fell to the ground, feeling the air around me solidify. Voices rang out around me. Grandmother's, mother's, Sophie's. They all screamed, accused, and pleaded. But amidst the chaos, I heard his voice. "Good job, girl," said my grandfather. His silhouette appeared in the air, dense as the darkness itself. "You're almost there." I realized that I hadn't just burned the ashes. I had destroyed the last anchor holding my family from his control. "Now everything will be as it should," he said, and his figure disappeared. I sat by the remnants of the fire, realizing that I had destroyed something more significant than just ashes. But the questions were just beginning. The next letter awaited me in the morning, an inevitable blow that couldn't be avoided. But this time it wasn't just an envelope. Next to it lay a box tied with coarse rope. It was stained with moisture and something that resembled rust but wasn't quite. The cardboard smelled of dampness, ash, and decay. Inside the envelope were just a few lines. "Take this and bury it. At the old cemetery by the grave I've shown you. You know where it is." My heart clenched. I knew what he was talking about. The cemetery where my grandfather rested, the place I had dared not tread for a long time. When I picked up the box, it was much heavier than I expected. Something inside rattled dully, knocking around. The box was strangely warm, as if it had just been pulled from a hot oven. I hesitated to leave immediately. Inside me, two voices fought. One screamed that I should stop this madness. The other assured that only by following these instructions could I put an end to everything. As always, the latter prevailed. I arrived at the cemetery in the midst of a gray, sluggish day. The place looked not just abandoned, but forgotten by time. Tombstones were overgrown with moss, and tree roots protruded from the ground, reaching upwards like long fingers. I walked to my grandfather's grave. Even from a distance, I recognized it. His tombstone was the only one without moss or dust. It seemed as if someone cared for it, though I knew that was not the case. The box in my hands grew warmer, almost scorching my fingers. I set it down on the ground and began to dig. Surprisingly, the earth yielded easily, as if someone had already prepared this place for me. As I dug a deep enough hole, I paused to catch my breath. At that moment, the box made a strange sound. It wasn't a knock, but rather a vibration, as if something inside had awakened. I stepped back, feeling fear freeze in my throat. "What are you waiting for?" a voice said behind me. I turned around and saw a figure in the shadow of a tree. It was a man, tall and thin, with his face half hidden by a hood. His eyes glowed with a yellow fire like that of a beast. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice betrayingly trembling. "I am what you have been searching for," he replied. "Morgan's warned you, but you didn't listen." His words struck like lightning. It was him, the one pulling the strings. But this was not just my grandfather. This was something that lived beyond his image. "What's in the box?" I asked. "Everything you fear, everything you want to forget," he said. "But you must do it. Your family has clung to the past for too long." "Why me? Why not you?" He laughed, and his laughter sounded like the crackling of dry branches. "Because I have you," he said. "You are my last victim." I lifted the box, ready to place it in the hole, but at the last moment I hesitated. "If this is what you want, I won't do it," I said. The man stepped closer, and I smelled the scent of burnt wood and blood. "You've been doing what I want for a long time," he said. "You just don't see it." With those words, he disappeared, leaving me alone with the box in the grave. I looked at the box. Something inside it stirred, as if its contents were alive. I tore the rope and opened the lid. Inside lay a dead head. It seemed only a few hours old because there was no smell. Instead, I thought it smelled of flowers and coffee. Something seemed familiar about the face, and under the dim light I recognized it. It was the guy who had left me his phone number at the cafe. A shiver of dread and panic hit me. I couldn't understand how or why he was connected to all this, since he couldn't have known my grandfather, unless Morgan's had done this. Frightened, I threw the box into the hole and started to bury it. I didn't need trouble with the police. It was simpler to bury and forget. When I finished, it seemed like the earth began to pulsate, as if it were a living thing. I stepped back, watching as something moved beneath the surface. Then I heard laughter. The same laughter I had heard before. It was around me, inside me. "You did everything right," said my grandfather's voice. "Now you are free." But I didn't feel free, only silence, which was worse than any sound. The silence of my home was no longer soothing. It had turned into a ringing tension from which I wanted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. A noise rang in my head, something between a whisper and an echo, causing pain in my temples. I sat on the floor, curled up, when there was a knock on the door. Not a letter. The sound was loud, sharp, as if someone demanded my attention. I slowly got up and approached the door. There was no one there. But on the threshold lay a new envelope, and beneath it, a thin leather cover. A Bible. I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's book, the one she read before sleep. Its pages smelled of age, mixed with lavender. And every time I opened it as a child, it seemed to know more than just the text. The envelope contained one sentence: "Desecrate the sanctuary to purify yourself." My hands trembled. This was no simple task. I knew that such destruction would change me, destroy something significant. But exactly what? I couldn't understand. The Bible lay in front of me on the table, and I stared at its worn spine. It was covered with tiny spots like tear stains and smelled just as I remembered. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't look away. When I finally did, I saw that the pages had changed. There were no familiar texts. Each line had turned into a black, writhing pattern that moved as I looked at it. In the center of the book, on one of the pages, was a note. a neatly folded piece of paper with text written in fine handwriting. It was my mother's handwriting. "Megan, if you found this letter, it means Grandfather continues his games. He never wanted our freedom. His power lies in our belief in him, in our memories. To break the connection, you must destroy not only his traces, but also what he used against us. The Bible is his tool. It is no longer our sanctuary. It is his vessel." I dropped the letter, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. The Bible, once a symbol of hope, had become something else. I knew I had to destroy it, but something inside me resisted. I put the book in my bag and stepped outside. The night was as dark as oil, and the air as heavy as before a storm. The furnace, which I had already used for other tasks, seemed even more ominous. I wandered the streets, lost in my thoughts, and at some point realized I was near a bench under a big tree next to some building. I took out the gasoline from my bag, which I didn't remember putting there. When I lit the fire, the flames glowed an unnatural color. They were dark red, like coagulated blood. The Bible lay on the edge, ready to be thrown inside. "Forgive me, Mom," I whispered, lifting it with trembling hands. I tossed the Bible through the open window of the building. Flames eagerly spread in all directions. At that moment, the ground beneath me shook as if something deep inside was awakening. I heard voices, faint and distant, but they grew louder. They weren't screams, not whispers. It was a chorus, singing something incomprehensible. Words I couldn't make out, but I felt their power. When the pages began to burn, a light burst from the flames, blinding me. It wasn't just the destruction of paper. It was something more. The flames transformed into a whirlwind within the building. In its center, I saw faces, the faces of my family. Mom, Dad, Sophie, Grandpa. Their features were blurred, but their eyes were crystal clear. "You're destroying us," said a voice that sounded from all directions. "We are your roots, your blood." "It's a lie," I screamed, trying to shout over the roar. "You are not my family. You are what keeps me in the past." Suddenly, a door on the side of the building opened, and from it crawled burning black creatures. They fell to the ground and writhed like black roots, slowly reaching towards my feet. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. "This is all that's left." I hastily stepped back, but the roots continued to reach for me. They emitted a disgusting squeal. They moved like snakes, contracting and expanding. I grabbed a shovel lying by the fence and began to chop them. Each strike resonated with a dull thud as if I were hitting something alive. When the last root was severed, I heard a scream. It wasn't a human scream, but a sound I will never forget. It was the scream of the house, the scream of the curse I was trying to destroy. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a siren, and not wanting to explain about the letters, I ran down the street in the opposite direction. Having run some distance, I collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Everything around quieted down. The flames danced in the distance, consuming the old town church, and the roots turned into ash that the wind carried into the night sky. But I knew it wasn't the end. A new letter awaited me on the doorstep, and this time I wasn't sure I wanted to open it. The next morning, I knew what I would find at the door. Barely opening it, I felt it. A cold that seemed to crawl under my skin, filling every cell with a sense of dread. The envelope lay on the threshold. It looked different. Its texture was rough, like old burlap, and its color was gray-green, reminiscent of fading moss. The ribbon tying it was black and tight, like a noose. I picked up the envelope, feeling its cold weight, and realized it contained not just a letter. Something inside rustled like dried leaves. My heart thumped loudly, as if keeping time with footsteps in the attic. I untied the ribbon, and before me lay a yellowed sheet of paper with crooked, trembling letters, as if written by a hand long unused. "You have destroyed things, but this is not the end. Return to where it all began. Find the truth, or forget yourself." Along with the letter was a candle. Its wax looked old, almost solidified, yet strangely unaffected by time. It smelled of frankincense and iron, filling the air with a strange flavor. I felt a slight dizziness, but I knew it wasn't from the smell. It was fear. The words on the paper squeezed the breath out of me. Return to where it all began. I knew where it led. My heart resisted, but my feet involuntarily took a step, and another. To my grandfather's house, to the attic. The house greeted me with silence. It was not the usual emptiness. It was viscous, almost thick, enveloping me like water pulling me into a whirlpool. I climbed the creaking stairs, feeling each step echo in the darkest corners of my memory. The attic smelled of dust and wood, as if the air itself aged along with the things it held. In the corner stood a chest. I remembered it so clearly, as if I had seen it just yesterday. It used to seem enormous, even menacing. Now it was just a box, but its lid, covered with deep cracks, still inspired dread. I knew what I would find inside. As I lifted the lid, the scent of childhood filled the room, the smell of old books, paper, toys. Inside, everything lay as I had left it after her death. Toys, drawings, a small diary with a colorful cover. On the very top lay a white rabbit with a torn ear. I slowly reached out and took it. The soft fabric seemed to radiate warmth, but it didn't soothe. It only intensified the pain. It was just as she had loved it, just as it had been on that day, that cursed day. Memories surged like water breaking through a dam. Sophia laughed in the garden, her cheerful voice echoing through the yard. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, and I watched her, and felt what? Envy, resentment. She was always the favorite, always so carefree, so innocent. But there was more. Another memory flickered, dark, vague. Us on the staircase, Sophia ahead, her little fingers gripping the railing. Me behind, my hands trembling. One step, one push. I flung the rabbit away as if it burned me. A scream rose inside me, but it didn't break out. Instead, I grabbed the rest of the things and started carrying them downstairs. With each step, they grew heavier, as if the weight of memories was turning into stones. In the backyard, I found an old stove that I hadn't used in a long time. It stood there covered in rust, a silent witness to what was supposed to happen. I started a fire. The rabbit caught fire first. Its fur quickly blackened, then the flames engulfed it, turning it to ash. Then I threw in the drawings. They began to curl as if resisting the fire. But when I got to the diary, everything changed. The diary was heavy, too heavy. The pages opened by themselves, and on them, I saw words I couldn't forget. "Why did you let me die?" I dropped it, feeling my legs give way. A whisper sounded in the air, quiet, barely audible, but clear. "You knew. You were there." I turned around, and there in the twilight stood Sophia, her little figure, face shrouded in shadow. Sophia stood in the half-light on the border of light and shadow, as if she herself didn't know which world she belonged to. Her face was unclear, as if fogged, but her eyes were piercing, full of pain and anger, like an open wound. I froze, feeling the cold fill the room. "You were there," she said, her voice quiet but her words spreading like thunder rolls. "You saw." "No," I breathed out, stepping back. "You lie," she said, her eyes becoming empty, like black holes. "You knew what you were doing." Memories surged again. The picture was blurry, but details began to emerge. Sophia and I on the staircase, her face cheerful, carefree. She looked back at me, her lips whispering something, but I couldn't hear the words. My hands gripped the railing tighter. I felt the pulse in my palms. One push. Light. Barely noticeable. But it was enough. "It was an accident," I whispered, as if trying to convince not her, but myself. "I didn't want to." "You did," she said, taking a step forward. Her figure distorted, like an image shattered in a mirror. "You wanted to get rid of me." I clenched my teeth, trying not to look at her, but my gaze kept returning magnetically. Her image trembled, changed, became increasingly frightening. Her skin dulled, her eyes sunk, her lips disappeared, revealing a cold void. "You tried to bury the truth." Her voice became low, like the roar of a distant storm. "You burned my things. You wanted to burn me." but I am still here." The shadows in the room came alive. They writhed on the walls, turning into figures I couldn't make out. I stepped back, but behind me was only the cold stove, still emitting smoke. At that moment, I heard footsteps, quiet, measured. I turned around and saw him. Grandpa stood in the doorway. His face was familiar, but something was off. It distorted, as if through frosted glass, and his eyes held something inhuman. "Did you think you could hide, girl?" His voice was dry, like the rustle of old pages. "Did you think fire would destroy memories?" "What do you want from me?" I yelled, feeling the air grow heavy. "I want nothing," he said, holding out his hand. In his fingers was the diary, the same one, charred but still intact. "It's you who wants to get out. But for that, you have to make a choice." I felt my knees buckle. The diary was in his hands, but I could see the pages inside. They came alive again, filled with images from our childhood. Sophia laughing, swinging on the swings, her hands reaching out to me. But in every scene, I was there too. And in all these memories, there was a toxic tinge of my guilt. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Because this is your truth," Grandpa replied. "You can keep it. You can leave it here, with yourself, or you can burn it. But if you burn it, you burn yourself." I felt the room begin to spin. The fire in the stove flared up, filling the space with light and shadows. Sophia looked at me, her eyes no longer malicious. Now they were just empty. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You've already chosen." Grandpa disappeared. Only his shadow stretched across the floor. I stood alone with the diary in my hands. Its weight was unbearable. It felt not like a book, but something alive, filled with memories, pain, secrets that could not be destroyed. I looked at the fire. Its flame stretched upward, taking on an emerald hue. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not knowing to whom these words were addressed. I threw the diary into the stove. The flames roared as if coming to life. I heard a scream. It wasn't human, but something ancient, inhuman. The diary burned slowly, its pages blackening one by one, as if resisting to the last. When the fire died down, I was left in silence. The ashes on the ground glowed. It was a dim green light that seemed more like a faint breath than the remains of paper. I left the attic feeling something inside me disappear. Memories of Sophia began to fade. Her face was no longer so clear. Her laughter, her voice, it all became smoke that dispersed on the wind. On the doorstep of my house awaited another envelope. It was sealed with red wax. On it were engraved words I couldn't help but read. "You will never be free." The next day I stood in front of Grandpa's house, holding another envelope. The wind fluttered the edges of the letter, as if it tried to escape from my grasp. The house seemed alive, its windows watching me like the eyes of an old man, full of reproach and expectation. At that moment, it seemed that this command was the last step, the end. But somewhere deep inside, I knew it wasn't that simple. For the first time in many years, the house was lit up. Light poured from the windows, creating the illusion of life inside. "You must do this," whispered the voice in my head. Grandpa's voice. I took a step forward but stopped. A figure flickered in the second-story window. It was too real to be a shadow. I approached closer, my heart clenched when I saw a car in front of the house. A police car. 2 officers stood at the gate. One was shouting into a radio, the other surveyed the area. I instantly understood. They weren't just patrolling, they had found something. And then it all became clear. Julia. The last time I saw her, she was with me in this house, but no one else had seen her since. Images flashed before my eyes. Her scream, a falling shadow, blood on the wooden floor of the attic. I pushed those memories away, but they returned with new force. "Hey," shouted one of the police officers. He noticed me. "Stay right there." But their words no longer reached me. In their figures, I saw something else. They weren't human. Their shadows were too long. Their voices sounded as if they were from another world. "It's him," It's his trap. They've come for you, whispered the same voice in my head. I couldn't let them take me, or the house. It was my duty to finish everything. Turning around, I picked up a canister of gasoline and, without hesitation, aimed it at the nearest officer. "Stop," he shouted, pulling out a gun. I bolted like a wild lynx. In a frenzied, spasmodic dance, I swung the canister, dousing everything around, including the police officers, with gasoline. They chased after me, trying to grab and knock me to the ground, but I kept dodging. They seemed like blurry silhouettes that I was merely playing with. I found it so amusing and funny. I lit the lighter and threw it, still laughing as I watched everything around me catch fire, including the two silhouettes I had just danced with. The heat consumed everything around. I awoke as if from a long nightmare, but reality was no less frightening. The smell of burnt wood and wet earth still hung in the air. Metal handcuffs tightly securing my hands behind my back burned my wrists. Other police officers surrounded me, and firefighters poured water on the remains of the house I had just tried to destroy. One of the officers, a man with a tired face and deep wrinkles around his eyes, leaned over me. His gaze held a mix of hatred and pain. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked, but his voice sounded distant. I could only stare at him, trying to focus. I heard someone nearby say the remains had been found inside. A woman, young. She had been missing for a long time. Julia. The image of her frightened, distorted face flashed before my eyes. A scream tore from my throat, but it wasn't heard, as if muffled by internal noise. "It wasn't me," I exhaled, but my words sounded like a whisper. "It was them. They made me do it." The officer shook his head, his face becoming even more grim. "Who are they, miss?" he asked, but his voice was now unsteady, as if he was talking to someone he didn't expect to understand. "You're alone here. There's no one else." Those words pierced me like an icy spike. Alone? No. They were here. Grandpa, Sophia, Julia. They watched me from the house window. Their voices rang in my head, even now. But the officer's cold, serious look made me momentarily doubt. I looked at my hands. There was no blood, but my fingers trembled as if they had just held something terrible. Memories fluttered in a wave, reality mixed with mirages. I remembered burning letters, toys, diaries, how Grandpa told me I had to save us all. But I hadn't killed Julia. Or had I? "Did you kill her?" The officer's voice rang out again, sharp as a blow. I looked up and saw he was holding Sophia's black diary. "Is this yours?" he asked. I couldn't respond. The diary was charred, its pages half torn, but even so I recognized it. It was the very book that spoke to me, accused me, whispered about my sins. I abruptly looked away, feeling my eyes begin to burn. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. "They don't understand. You know it was necessary. No one else will do it for you." I screamed again, but the officers only gripped me tighter. They lifted me to my feet, dragging me to the car. On the way, I turned back to the burning house. Shadows danced in its windows. I saw someone standing there in the corner of the room, someone's long arms embracing the walls. It was Grandpa, or what remained of him. He looked at me and smiled. I didn't know how much time had passed. I sat in a cold, sterile room. White walls, a metal table. The windows were closed, but beyond them, I heard the noises coming from the street. A psychiatric hospital. Or prison. I didn't know. A man in a white coat sat in front of me. His face was calm, his voice soft, like a teacher explaining something difficult to a small child. "Megan," he said, looking straight into my eyes, "do you understand where you are?" "It's all their fault," I whispered. "They made me do it. Grandpa, Sophia, Julia, Morgan's. Oh my God, that guy from the cafe, did I really do that?" He bowed his head, writing something in his notebook. "Who made you do it, Megan? Your grandfather has been dead for many years. Sophia, your sister, who died when you were 10. And Julia, he paused. Julia disappeared 6 months ago. We found her body in the house. Do you remember what happened? I turned away, feeling a wave of panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to remember, but the images, like a film, slowly unfolded in my mind. Julia was screaming, her face twisted in terror. I pushed her, but I didn't remember why. Only pain and fear. They wanted me to set us free, I whispered. Grandpa said I had to burn everything so they would leave. The man looked at me for a long time, his eyes filled with sympathy, but there was no belief in him. He wrote something down, then stood up. I'll be back tomorrow, Megan, he said. We'll try to talk again. He left and I was alone. The room was dark, only faint light from the corridor seeped through a small window in the door. But I was not alone. In the corner of the room I saw a silhouette. Sophia was standing there, her eyes watching me from the shadows. Did you tell them? Her voice was quiet, but it echoed in me like a scream. You've ruined everything. Now they know. No, I said, clenching my fists. You're not real. You can't be real. I am here because you did it. We are all here. You were supposed to finish, but you couldn't. I closed my eyes, trying to drown out her voice, but it continued to sound, and now others joined it. Grandpa, Julia, all of them. They were with me, always will be. I opened my eyes again. There was an envelope on the table in front of me. I hadn't seen it appear, but I knew it would be there. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was inscribed with just 2 lines. This will never end. You must finish what you started. And I understood. There was no escape from this captivity. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.